This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
When you consider that during the prime of life, I was denied the opportunity to make a living by the measures of the Red regime, by the inflation, by unbearable tax burdens, etc., and that instead of the gratitude of the fatherland, we veterans were ruled by a group of profiteers who used every possible means to reduce the starvation pennies we needed to live, then maybe you can understand why some of those who were swindled and gypped greeted the nationalist paramilitary organizations, and particularly the Hitler movement, with enthusiasm. Hans Buchner, 1932. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we'll be further exploring the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1920s. Now, as we mentioned at the end of the last episode, the Nazis in 1928 were still a pretty small party. They have, at the beginning of this kind of period that we're covering in the lecture today, they have about 75,000 members, which is not insignificant, but, in a country of millions and millions of people, that's not really something to be so excited about. In the 1928 federal elections, the Nazis receive about 800,000 votes, which again is not nothing. But if you consider that that's just 2.63% of the total, you're talking about, again, a very small party, a splinter party. You're talking about, in the context of American politics, maybe the Green Party, maybe the Constitutional Party, right? One of these small groups that shows up, but nobody really takes very seriously. And yet, in 1930, the Nazis would experience a massive electoral breakthrough. They go from winning about 800,000 votes to winning 6.3 million votes. They go from basically being an afterthought in the kind of electoral landscape to becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. They win over 18% of the vote in 1930. And this isn't just some sort of one-off, right? This is the moment of the big Nazi breakthrough. They will follow up 2 years later by doubling this total. They become the single largest party in the Reichstag in the summer of 1932. So, of course, the big question here is, well, how did they pull this off? How did Nazism grow from being this kind of small thing on the side to becoming suddenly the largest party in all of Germany, and especially in the Reichstag, in the parliament itself? This is going to be the central question that we're going to try to answer in today's episode about the Nazis and electoral warfare. Now, as we mentioned at the start of our previous podcast episode, part of the explanation that historians often give, how do the Nazis grow so quickly, so exponentially? Well, the election of 1930 happens at the beginning of the Great Depression. By 1932, things are even worse. And of course, you just heard the words of Hans Buchner, who's talking in the sort of middle of the Great Depression in Germany. And, what is he upset about? Well, clearly economics has a big role to play in that story. And I would say it's not just economics in the sense of, well, things aren't going so well today, right? There aren't lots of jobs. Unemployment is high. What Hans is upset about is deeper than that. He is expressing a sense of injustice. It's not just that, well, the American loans ran out because people were speculating on the stock market and, well, I guess things aren't so great today, but maybe they will be tomorrow. there is a sense that he has been screwed over, that he and others fought for the fatherland, they risked their lives, and what did they get in return? It wasn't just that, well, things weren't great, it was that there were war profiteers. There were people behind the lines that should have had his back, and instead they stabbed him in the back. Instead, they reached into his pockets and tried to steal his money while he was laying on the battlefield. This sense of injustice is a huge part of what drives interest in National Socialism. So that part makes sense to us. That part, I would agree, right? The Great Depression does fuel the Nazi growth. But what's interesting to consider, if you take out the idea that, well, the Nazis become obviously the ones who carry out the nationalist revolution in 1933, set that aside for a moment, and consider that in 1930, the Nazis are one of many parties on the sort of nationalist conservative right who want to carry out some kind of authoritarian revolution. They're not the only possible alternatives out there for Germans who look at the Weimar Republic and say, well, that thing isn't working. I don't like it. It was an injustice to begin with. There are several other choices out there. Political parties that in some ways are better positioned than the Nazis. If we're talking about the Great Depression as being a driver of electoral radicalism, then we also need to include the communists in this discussion. Right? If you're someone who, maybe was on the fence about the Weimar Republic in 1925, but by 1932, you're like, I'm done with it. Hey, the communists are there proposing radical alternatives as well. So why is it that Hitler and the Nazi Party managed this growth? It's not just, well, Hitler was a great speaker. Many of these other parties have very good speakers. Many of them are certainly better financed than the Nazi Party. So what is it that made the Nazis stand out so clearly to voters, first in 1930 and then in 1932? The answer, as we're going to explore in today's podcast, is not random. It's not chance. It's not, well, Hitler was a good speaker, but it lies in the specific practice of politics that the Nazis are able to invent between 1928 and 1930. Again, it goes back to not even ideology so much, right? Which we tend to focus on a lot. It doesn't even really depend on personalities. There are various electoral strategies that the Nazis either invent or develop, and these allow them to contrast not just with the SPD, with the KPD, the communists. This allows them to develop a contrast with all the other parties out there. The Nazis in 1930 seem dynamic. They seem modern. They are doing things and sending messages to people in ways that no one had ever done, and that allows them to achieve this electoral breakthrough. And so, of course, again, that's what we're going to talk about in today's episode. Before we get to that, of course, some of you, this is your first time listening to the podcast. So just as a brief reminder, if you're listening for the first time, this is now our 6th episode on the history of the rise of National Socialism. If you haven't heard the previous episodes, you can, of course, find an overview of them on our website, as well as some reading recommendations. The website is www.historyoffthepage.com. You can also find an overview of some of our other episodes. We've done over 20 hours on Israel and Palestine, and we'll probably go back and pick up a little bit more of that in the near future. We did an episode on the historical origins of the war in Ukraine, which also seems to keep going on and on. We've got stuff about the history of Christmas, the history of sexuality, Bismarck, art, right? You name it. We've got a lot of stuff on there, so feel free to check out the website. Finally, don't forget about our Patreon-only episodes. We have 2 that are up right now called The Making of Hitler, and the other one is Nazism and the Occult. My hope is in the next couple weeks to release a 3rd episode on a short history of the SS. It'll get into the rise of the SS, talk about things like the concentration camps, talk about the Night of the Long Knives, talk about, obviously, the Holocaust. So we're going to put a lot into that episode. You can access these for just $2 a month. And of course, that also helps the show. And so we greatly appreciate it. Okay, let's get back to the history. And let's start by talking about the contributions of Joseph Goebbels. Now, of course, if I say Joseph Goebbels, even those of you that are sort of casual history buffs, you've read a book or two about Nazism, you remember hearing about the Nazis in high school or college. If I say the word Joseph Goebbels, you immediately think of propaganda. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? Joseph Goebbels becomes eventually the head of the Nazi propaganda offices. When the Nazi seize power, he kind of combines that with a federal office and becomes the propaganda minister. But if we back things up a little bit, what we find is that Joseph Goebbels is actually a key player in the initial buildup and sort of rise of the Nazi Party. And one of his first kind of contributions that gets him known is not just his propaganda efforts, but it's the party organizing that he does in what was known as sort of the Red Bastion of Berlin. If you recall from our last episode, the 29-year-old Goebbels had basically been named the Gauleiter, or Nazi district leader of the capital of Berlin in the fall of 1926. And he will basically make the Nazis competitive in the city of Berlin. He will start to develop tactics, electoral tactics, political tactics, however you want to define them, but he will start to find a way to put the Nazi movement on the map in a place that is utterly dominated, as we'll see in a second, by the socialists, by the communists. And so he gets known as sort of one of the main sort of organizers of the Nazi Party. So we're talking about the big Nazi breakthrough. We want to go in and see a little bit more closely how it is that Goebbels managed to pull this off, because it's such a key part, again, of the story of how the Nazis managed their breakthrough. Now, Berlin in the 1920s is, as I said, it is a red bastion. It is the heart of the Social Democratic Party, of the Communist Party. And in many ways, the city itself is just the antithesis of what National Socialism is supposed to be. It is this bustling hub of modernity and urbanization and commerce and lights and cultural experimentation. The population of Berlin had doubled just since the end of World War I, growing from 1.9 million to over 4 million people. Think about that for a second. I'm not talking about, over the course of a century or over the course of several decades. We're talking about in the span of 10 years, the population of the city doubles. Now, while part of this is due to industrial growth, immigration from other parts of Germany, a big part of it is the passage of something called the Greater Berlin Act of 1920, which will annex over 80,000 hectares of land to the city. If you've ever been to Berlin, or if you go to Berlin today, there's the S-Bahn is one of the big kind of subway networks. Usually it's above ground, but basically there's a Ringbahn and it goes all the way around the edges of the city. That area where the Ringbahn is today and even further, those were all before 1920 independent cities. Places like Charlottenburg, Köpenick, Lichtenberg, Neukölln, Spandau. But the Greater Berlin Act will basically incorporate them into the city. And it will create, again, this sort of exponential growth. Now, Berlin is not only just a massive city with millions of people, but it is also a fully industrialized city. There are a couple parks. There's obviously the Tiergarten is a very big one in the sort of center of Berlin. But in the 1920s, it's full of people. It's full of traffic, especially these newfound things called automobiles. You've got factories, power plants, trains. Berlin is also the site of a lot of economic change. It is, or there are parts of the city, one could say, where you have the glitzy department stores. You have the emphasis on commerce and buying things and shopping. And a lot of older Germans go, I don't know if I like all this materialism. This sounds very American. This idea of, I'm just going to go out and buy stuff just because I want it. That's kind of scary. Culturally speaking, Berlin is also the home to a lot of non-political experimentation. Berlin is one of the centers of cabaret. If you've ever seen the musical Cabaret, right? Cabaret is set in Berlin in 1930, 1931, right? Because there's all these cabarets there. Berlin also has a relatively open or public gay culture, especially for men, right? So homosexuals, there are bars you can go to that are very openly for gay people. And so, again, the capital is this place for experimentation, commerce, social mobility, all these things that we associate with modernity. And so it's not really a good place for the Nazis to try to grow their movement, right? If you're trying to sell Nazism, going to a place where, again, there's a lot of homosexuality, or at least public homosexuality, there's a lot of department stores, there's a lot of factories, there's a lot of just hustle and bustle, that's not the place that you're going to do really well. Just to give you a number to drive this point home, on the day that Joseph Goebbels shows up in Berlin in 1926, the Nazi Party has a whopping 300 members. 300 members in a city of 4 million people. The Nazi Party is not only insignificant in Berlin in 1926, it's invisible. It's practically non-existent. Berlin also has an SA chapter. This is slightly larger. It has about 500 people that had signed up for it. But if you look at the early history of the SA, they often kind of think of what they're doing as being independent or parallel to what the Nazi Party is doing, as opposed to kind of being like the grunt soldiers who are waiting for the party to tell them what to do. This was the case in Berlin. The local SA commander, a guy named Kurt de Lüge, basically said, I'm going to do whatever I want. What do I want to do? Why did I join the SA? Because I want to brawl. Right? The SA is in some ways, it's a paramilitary force, but it's also kind of gang-like in some ways. So what are we going to do? Let's go fight those communists. Let's go fight those social democrats in the pubs, on the streets. The Nazi Party that Goebbels takes over has basically no money. And again, the problem isn't just that the Nazis are small and insignificant, but the communists and the social democrats, the SPD, they look at Berlin as the home of their movements. They both have headquarters there. If you put the two groups' vote share together in December of 1924, they are the majority. They exceed 50%. And as you go through election after election, even into the 1930s, even into the Great Depression, they either reach 50% together or they usually get pretty close to it. So Joseph Goebbels is 29. He's walking into this kind of sea of opposition on many different levels. He has very little resources. So how is he going to turn things around? Well, he's going to start by having the kind of right mindset for it. Now, Joseph Goebbels is not physically imposing. If you listen to our last episode, you remember that he was club-footed. He's kind of small. He was kind of sickly as a boy. But he's also kind of like, if you go out walking your dog sometimes, or if you're around small dogs, sometimes small dogs, even though they're small, they don't act small. They are very aggressive. They have this kind of chip on their shoulder. They have a kind of brawler's mentality, even though if they ever got in a fight, they'd probably wind up in a lot of trouble. This is the mindset that Joseph Goebbels brings to Berlin. Now, once Goebbels arrives in the capital, he immediately begins to assert his authority over the local SA. And he does this in a smart way. He goes up to de Lüge and he says, hey, how would you like to be my number 2? How would you like to be my deputy? And so de Lüge says, of course, this is kind of like a promotion. This is good. I'm moving up the party ranks. I'm moving up the ladder. But once he's a member of the party and the SA, then the SA's desire to go off and do its own thing is obviously going to be lessened. Goebbels also attacks the financial issue. He sets up a fundraising group called the NS Freedom Association. The idea here is not just to fund the day-to-day activities of the movement, but Goebbels also understands the power of perception. Our next episode is going to focus on kind of the story of how Hitler comes to power in 1932 to 1933. And the lead-in clip I'm going to play for you is from an HBO miniseries called Game of Thrones. It was a massively popular series about 10 years ago. Probably a lot of you have seen it before. And one of the things that they argue about in this series a lot is the question of power. Where does power come from? And one of the kind of arguments that some of the characters make in the show is that power is where people believe it is. It's not necessarily having the soldiers or the sword or whatever, but it is the belief that you have them. The belief that you're a big deal is what really creates power. This is Joseph Goebbels' understanding of power as well. He gets that if you want to make your party into something, you can't have a headquarters in a basement somewhere. You can't show up in dirty clothes and you're just walking off the subway. You don't want to look ordinary. And so part of the reason that he sets up this fundraising group is he wants to buy things. He wants to make the Nazi party seem like they're players, even if they're really not. Right, again, 300 people in your movement, nobody's impressed by that. But if you show up in a brand new car and you've got an ability to kind of transform it into a speaking thing, and you're using radio or amplifiers, which are brand new, if you're doing rallies every day, you can make yourself seem bigger than you are, and that is a path to power. Now, the other thing that this does, of course, is that it secures him a steady stream of revenue so that he doesn't have to keep going back to Munich and saying to the Nazi headquarters, give me money, give me money, give me money. We talked about this also in our last episode about the franchisee problem. What happens when you start franchising out and then the people that are franchisees decide to do other things, decide to make decisions on their own? Well, from the perspective of the franchisee, you want to be able to have independence. If you own a Chick-fil-A franchise, you don't really have a lot of independence, right? The corporation controls a lot of what you're able to do. But what if you can come up with an alternative revenue stream, an alternative way of kind of liberating yourself from what the larger sort of corporate entity is telling you what to do? And this is basically what Goebbels realizes. If I can get my own money, I don't have to ask headquarters for money to buy a car. I can just buy it. Another thing Goebbels will do is, again, when he makes his public appearances, he does things like he shows up late. He tries to build anticipation in the crowd as opposed to being like me, where you show up 10 minutes early and you're already on the stage and everybody's kind of quiet and ready to go when it's the time to start, right? He's like the rock star band that never, ever comes out on time to begin their show. He does buy a new car. He does fund a new headquarters for the Nazi party. And the car, as I mentioned, has a kind of dual feature. They build a little platform. So now he can stand on top of the platform and talk down to you, as opposed to being just another guy on a street corner yelling and screaming in the middle of the 1920s. Another thing that Goebbels realizes in terms of propaganda is the value of publicity and of performance. Now, maybe today in the era of social media, we maybe understand this a little bit better. But in this period, in the middle of the 1920s, most public speakers, most politicians, they still understand the art of rhetoric, the idea of giving a speech, as basically reading off of a paper. Most people getting their information before the mid-1920s, or even up to about 1930, they don't get their information directly from the guy giving the speech. They get that information through the printed word, through newspaper write-ups, leaflets, things like that, or through their friends who are saying, well, I saw this guy speak, this is what he said. And so if that's the way that information is circulating, your delivery of the information isn't really so important. What really matters in the mid-1920s and earlier is who you are. It's not the words you're saying, it's what is the background of the person that's saying them. If it is someone from a noble family, If it is a pastor or a priest or a bishop, well, that's something you should really take into consideration. If it's some guy just from the street, who cares what he has to say? Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, when Paul von Hindenburg runs against Hitler for president in 1932, Hindenburg, his whole electoral campaign, is giving a grand total of one speech. And then he'll do one radio address as well. That's the whole campaign that he does. Now, they put up posters and flyers and there's some electioneering, but that's all that Hindenburg himself will do. Goebbels, like Hitler, understands the modern idea of rhetoric. The idea that when we talk, things like diction and pace and intonation, these are significant because people don't just listen to the words you're saying, but it is a kind of total experience. If you go online, you can see these interesting pictures of Hitler, and he's posing, and he's got these kind of like strange hand gestures that he's doing. And the reason he's doing that is he's practicing to see, well, what does it look like? How can I hold my hand to try to not mesmerize the audience, but to make the presentation sort of multi-sensory in a way. Goebbels expands upon this and understands the value of performance, that it's not just even the speeches that you give, but that performing your values is a better way to attract new followers than simply talking about them. If you want to use an analogy from the 1960s, it's not just that you say, oh, I'm against the war, but you participate in things like direct action, or you want to do environmental protest or gender-based protests, sexuality-based protests, whatever. Direct action can be more effective in terms of raising awareness of your cause than simply rhetorical action. So if you're Joseph Goebbels, you're 29, you show up in Berlin, it's dominated by communists and by social democrats, how are you going to demonstrate your Nazi values? Could there be a better way than literally fighting the communists? Get yourself into a street brawl and show people that, unlike a lot of these sort of liberal democratic parties, bourgeois parties, even the kind of normie conservative parties, we're not afraid of a little communist violence. In fact, we're going to be that little dog that's going to go charge the big German Shepherd or the Great Dane. So just a week after taking over, Goebbels organizes a march through the working class district of Neukölln, which is heavily dominated by the communists. Now, this wasn't the best move, sort of from a physical standpoint. The Nazis, again, are very small. They literally get their asses kicked by the communists. They have to run away. But in a more immediate sense, at the local level, the message is sent. If you are someone who doesn't like the communists and is a little bit worried about, how much resolve do the communist opponents have, some people are like, wow, those Nazi guys are pretty brave. Those Nazi guys are not just going to rely on a parliamentary committee to investigate whether or not the communists are planning an insurrection. They are going to take the fight to the communists. And there's some people that like that. There are some people that say the Nazis are men of action. The notables meeting in the back rooms of beer halls, giving speeches and talking about their 10-point platform, those guys are useless. They're not doing anything. This is not the first or only time that Goebbels will start to realize the value of direct action. And in fact, he will build upon this idea to realize the value of violence and the way that violence can get you media attention. People talk today sometimes about the attention economy. What is it that people are paying attention to? Is it the tariffs? Is it the war in Ukraine or Gaza? Is it Sydney Sweeney and her jeans ad? The attention economy drives a lot of our politics in some ways. Goebbels realizes this a century before we did. He understands that the Nazi Party, again in 1926, is fairly small. A lot of people don't even know it's in Berlin. So how can we grow that? We know that the major newspapers are not going to cover some speech that some random group with 300 people had in it, how are you going to get attention? The answer is violence. We love violence. We are fascinated by violence. Think about high school or even middle school. You were minding your own business. You were at your locker. If you're like me, when we had lockers, maybe today you don't have lockers. But someone comes running down the hall and says, oh, there's a fight. And suddenly everybody, oh, let's go see the fight. Let's go watch the fight. Even today, we're fascinated. We don't do boxing as much anymore, but UFC. Oh, UFC is big today, baby. Because we love to watch people fight each other. So Goebbels understands that this is an attractor for attention. And he says, okay, how can we as Nazis be more violent in order to get the coverage of the papers that are so far ignoring us? And so an excellent example of his strategy is the so-called Battle of Ferris Hall, which happens in February 1927. So this is just a couple months after Goebbels has taken over the Berlin Party. Now, Ferris Hall is not just some random venue, but it is one that is used often by the communists to celebrate rallies. It is in a heavily working-class neighborhood called Wedding. The Nazis used to call Wedding Red Wedding because it was, of course, again, beating heart of communism in the capital. By booking this hall for his rally, Goebbels sends a direct challenge to the KPD. He puts up posters all around the neighborhood and says, hey, I'm coming into your neighborhood. I'm going to give a rally. Guess what's going to happen? Communists are like, well, you're not coming into our territory. And so when they have the meeting, a bunch of communist guys try to get into the meeting. They come, they're ready to fight. They've got brass knuckles. Some of them have chains, or even like, think about the stereotypical image you see in movies where somebody's got like an iron pipe and they're ready to brawl. So some of those communist guys go into the meeting. They're like, we're going to throw down. We're going to interrupt the meeting. Screw these people who are trying to take our territory. Goebbels anticipates this. They allow some of those communists into the meeting hall, but they make sure that it's a 4-to-1 ratio in favor of the Nazis. Most of the guys in the hall are not random people from Wedding that are coming in off the street because, well, they're just curious about what is this party, what is their program. It is SA men who have come to fight. And so when the communists start, making catcalls and trying to interrupt it, they get surrounded by this group of SA men, and there becomes a huge fight. And in the end, the outnumbered communists are defeated. Reports state that there were 85 wounded communists. The Nazis have somewhere between 10 to 20 wounded members. And Goebbels celebrates this violence. He actually says, look, these guys are wounded. Guess what, fellas? Come up on the stage. Let's see your war wounds. Let's see the blood that you were willing to sacrifice for the movement. Let's honor you and celebrate your heroism because of what you did for the bigger movement. Couple things going on here. One, in terms of the local idea of what the Nazi Party is, right? A lot of the people joining it, especially in this early period, they're not thinking about the party program. They're not people that are, going to go into the beer halls or the meeting rooms and listen to speeches and think about the politics of it. Some of it is about the sociology of people. Basically, how do human beings form bonds of affection with each other, especially men, non-romantic bonds with each other? One of the ways that men have done this historically, and including to the modern day, is through fighting. If you've ever been on a football team, you know that those are your brothers, right? You've been on a rugby team. Those guys, they bleed for you. You bleed for them. You've got each other's back all the time. And so by calling those men up there and celebrating it, it's not just that, on that day they got some recognition, but in the weeks and months afterwards, when they get together to have a beer on a Friday night, they're going to tell that story about Hans. Now, Hans fought the big communist guy, and Hans was little. And maybe Hans got his ass kicked, but he didn't die. Or maybe Hans threw a really good punch and gave that guy a whipping and, gave him a black eye. violence, as it does today with hooligan gangs, acted as a socializing agent for the nascent Nazi Party. The SA men reaffirmed their new bonds of fraternity, and again, they do this not just in the immediate moment, but again and again and again. The other thing going on here that, again, Joseph Goebbels recognizes and will make a core part of Nazi sort of electoral strategy is that violence gets you media attention. After the Battle of Ferris Hall, all of the major Berlin dailies write stories about it. A lot of them don't like the Nazis or the communists and write about, well, these Nazi guys are barbarians. Look at this bloody fight. Why are we fighting about politics? Come on, it's 1927. Hyperinflation is past us. We live in a democracy. We don't need to fight each other. But just like a viral video today, people go, oh, wow, there was a fight. Look at these crazy guys. Look at these violent guys. Look at the blood that was fought. Look at how insane it is. That gets you media attention. And some of the people that are kind of sympathetic to the Nazis or people that are sympathetic to the broader sort of conservative nationalist cause or would identify themselves in that kind of sector of the German political electorate, those people say, well, the Nazis are kind of cool. I like what they're doing. I like that they're really standing up. Maybe I should join them. Maybe I should check out a meeting. In terms of its political effectiveness, using violence is massively effective in growing the Nazi Party in Berlin. Now, as I've said, Goebbels is well aware of this. He is also, or becomes, a sort of propaganda maestro. He understands the value of creating this idea of what the movement is, not in, again, dry intellectual speak, but in a very kind of lived experience. And so he will create symbols such as the unknown SA man. He'll tell these stories about, again, that this SA guy, he doesn't even have a name. He's an ordinary Joe, ordinary Jurgen, if you want to say. He's minding his own business. He loves his country. And then he gets ganged up and attacked by these dirty communists. These people that don't want to play by the rules. They try to stab him in the back. They try to bring him down using nefarious means. They're not honorable. And so Goebbels begins to create a whole system of symbols and rituals that stress Nazi values and that, again, kind of use the communists or oftentimes also Jews as being the kind of underhanded figure to create this sense of injustice that we saw Hans Buchner talking about at the beginning of the podcast. The most powerful of these symbols was one that we've already talked about. This was the murder or killing of one of the local SA leaders, a guy named Horst Wessel. Horst was basically killed in a dispute about rent. So he owes some rent to this lady, and her boyfriend or ex-boyfriend was a member of the KPD. So she kind of rats him out where he's going to be. They show up, they shoot him. Goebbels doesn't tell this story. He tells the story of the brave Horst Wessel and, of course, how honorable he was and how he was betrayed and murdered by these underhanded communist guys. Horst Wessel had also written a fight song called Raise the Flag, and this is now renamed after Wessel's death in his honor. There's a massive parade through the streets of Berlin. In German, it's called the Horst Wessel Lied, and it becomes the unofficial German anthem after the seizure of power in 1933. In other words, this becomes such a powerful symbol that it essentially becomes the Nazi anthem, if you will. Goebbels' efforts to grow the party in Berlin, as I said, are immediately successful. Over the course of the first couple months of 1927, membership in the Nazi Party in Berlin, just in Berlin, rises from about 300 to over 3,000 members. So we're talking about tenfold growth in just 6 months. Over the course of 1927 and 1928, Goebbels builds on this. He continues to get, of course, more members. More members means more resources. More resources means increasing capabilities. He buys at one point a 7-seat Opel. And again, as I mentioned, it's not just that, well, now we have a shiny new car, but we can set up a speaking platform on top of it, and it distinguishes us from some of those other crazy movements that are out there. If you're going to have a political rally, it's boring if you just have, okay, we're going to have these 3 people come up and speak. Think about a modern political rally or a political convention. We got to have music. And so he will put together a Nazi band. We're going to sing songs and do rituals and make it, again, multisensory, more immersive. Make going to a Nazi rally not just about the words, but about the experience, which is a much better way to sell fascism. In July 1927, Goebbels will release the first issue of a new newspaper. This is called Der Angriff, or The Attack. And this is going to be Goebbels' sort of personal Nazi party voice. There are other Nazis with other newspapers, especially the Strasser brothers. This is the one that Goebbels is going to use to drive his idea of National Socialism. But again, Goebbels is brilliant in terms of his propaganda, not just because he doesn't care about the truth. He's very open about, I'm just going to say whatever I feel like saying, whatever I need to say in order to get the point across that I want to make. But notice the way that it leans into Nazi ideals of masculinity. Der Angriff, the attack. We are not sitting back and waiting for some kind of communist revolution. We are going to take the fight to them. We are not going to be passive. Being passive is effeminate. We are masculine men. We are the men that fought in World War I, or were asterisk the generation of 1900 that would have done it. We wanted to. We're brawlers. We're not afraid of violence. All of this is summarized just in the single word title of the paper. Now, it does take some time to develop this. The first couple issues, Goebbels writes a lot of the articles. It's very heavy. It's very intellectual. But he picks up pretty quickly that the way that you really want to get attention is not through making a great intellectual argument. It's through a kind of tabloid style. Another thing that Goebbels does to kind of make it more effective is, I'm not going to go after 17 different people with my newspaper. I want to focus on one particular issue at a time, one particular enemy. And I don't want to just go after the abstract group that are out there. In this case, one of his favorites were the idea of going after Jews. Some people have Jewish friends. Some people go, the Jews, they're not so bad. You go after individuals that then you can caricature. And so in particular, the deputy police chief of the city of Berlin was Jewish. And Goebbels will use the Angriff to go after him mercilessly. He will be sued about a dozen times for libel. But it's kind of like the Streisand effect, where by having the lawsuit, by having the issue come up in the papers, you start to generate interest in it. And regardless of how the actual legal case works out, in the end, the fight, the struggle gets you the attention and allows you to convince people of whatever your position is. Within 3 months of setting up Der Angriff, Goebbels is selling over 2,000 copies of the paper every day. So relatively quickly, Goebbels begins to transform the Nazi Party in Berlin from this kind of non-entity into a significant player in the city's political scene. Now, it's important to note that despite Goebbels' efforts, Berlin stays a red city. Right? As I said, it is almost half of its vote is almost always going to go to the communists or the social democrats in some kind of combined fashion. But on the eve of the seizure of power in 1933, the Nazi vote share had increased to somewhere between 1/4 and 1/5 of the vote, depending on which election you're looking at. Again, the party had become a force to be reckoned with in one of the most urban and modern environments in all of Germany. Now, so far over the first half of the podcast, I've talked mostly about Joseph Goebbels, and that probably doesn't surprise you, again, because he's so associated with propaganda. But the change in Nazi electoral fortunes was also due to another future prominent Nazi that I know you guys have heard of, but you usually don't associate with electoral politics, and that's Heinrich Himmler. Now, we haven't really talked a lot about Himmler, so I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail here about his background. Himmler was born in Munich in 1900. His family was basically very well connected. His dad had been a tutor for one of the Wittelsbach princes. They were a deeply Catholic family, as a lot of people are in Bavaria even today. By all accounts, Himmler was actually a fairly good student. He struggled a little bit physically, but he was also a hard worker. He practiced fencing, he practiced running, jumping. He kind of overcame these physical limitations in a way that Joseph Goebbels didn't. Himmler was a little awkward socially. And unlike some of the more popular Nazis we've talked about, people like Joseph Goebbels, people like Gregor Strasser, Himmler was often sort of irritable and difficult to get along with, especially for people that were kind of below him in the ranks or that he didn't kind of have a personal contact with. We'll talk in a moment about some of his electoral contributions. At times, he's like got this whole plan laid out to start the big electoral campaign, but basically because the local chapter hadn't crossed all the T's and dotted all their I's, he's like, well, we're not going to start the big campaign, right? You've got to finish checking all these boxes. And the letters that he writes to people, he's kind of a jerk in the way that he talks to even people within the movement. Like many young Germans, Himmler tries to fight in World War I. He enlists in December of 1917. So he goes through kind of training, but he never actually gets to see combat before the war ends 10 months later. Goes back to Bavaria. He's befriended by this guy named Ernst Röhm that we've talked about quite a bit. Röhm says, well, if you really want a military career, you should join the Reichskriegsflagge, or the Imperial War Flag Society. Now, the Imperial War Flag Society is not like a group of men sitting around talking about war flags. It is a paramilitary organization. And from here, Himmler will follow a pretty typical pattern towards radicalism. As he gets into the early 1920s, he doesn't really have a lot of money. He dreams about this idea of becoming a military officer, but he's not able to kind of break through. Of course, Germany had limitations on the number of soldiers it could have in its army, so there's a lot more people that want to be in the military than can be. Himmler will start reading about nationalist and folkish and anti-Semitic kind of texts in this period. In August of 1923, he will officially join the Nazi Party. Now, this is an interesting time to join because you're really right on the eve of the Beer Hall Putsch. When the Beer Hall Putsch takes place, Himmler will be kind of a foot soldier in the movement. He literally is holding one of the flags of the Reichskriegsflagge as they participate as a paramilitary group in the uprising. The key period for Himmler's development, intellectually speaking, happens around the time of the putsch and then immediately afterwards. In the words of his biographer, Peter Longreich, this was a period when he was, quote, trying to find a worldview. It's a period when he starts to move away from his Catholic upbringing. And as those of you who have listened to our episode on Nazism and the occult know, this is the moment that Himmler starts reading about Norse gods and Odin and Freya and, well, you know, there's this kind of occult knowledge out there that he's definitely very curious about. At the same time, Himmler is still sort of searching for a path in life. And so Gregor Strasser will come along and say, hey, you seem like a decent fellow. I know you're committed to the movement. I need a personal secretary because I'm involved in all these things, right? Gregor Strasser, if you'll remember, was basically a relative nobody, but he was a very good organizer, very good speaker, very charismatic. And his sort of rise in the Nazi Party happened very quickly in 1922-23. In December of 1924, Strasser gets elected to the Reichstag, which means he's got to go to Berlin a lot. But Strasser is from Lower Bavaria, so he doesn't want to give up being the official leader of that area. So he says, okay, Himmler, you stay here in Bavaria. You take care of running the local party offices. I'm going to go off to Berlin and campaign and try to build the Nazi Party in the north. So Himmler becomes someone who's not just involved in the SS, which is what happens later, but he is someone who is doing the politics of electoral campaigning. He's giving speeches to the party faithful. Himmler's writing articles for the local Nazi newspapers. He's supervising the bureaucratic growth of the party. He's looking at membership rolls, dues collections. And so basically for 2 years, Himmler is operating as this kind of key local party functionary. And then in 1926, he's also appointed the district leader of an SS unit, and that will kind of begin to move him into policing. It's a longer story that we'll get into in our special episode on the SS. In January of 1927, however, he gets promoted again by Strasser. And this time, Heinrich Himmler will become the deputy propaganda chief for the entire Reich. So when people are thinking about how does Heinrich Himmler really get his name made, it's first working as Strasser's secretary, and then it's being the deputy propaganda chief for the entire Reich. Now, shortly after taking over in January of 1927, there is an election in the German state of Thuringia. The Nazis had put a lot of effort into it. They thought this is really an opportunity. We're going to have, a really good showing in the local election. And when the polls close, they win a whopping 3.5% of the vote. As they are searching for answers as to why things didn't go better, the local party looks at the national party and says, you guys screwed this up. You didn't give us the resources that we needed in order to really electioneer. Himmler, as the deputy propaganda chief, the guy who's kind of working behind the scenes to make the propaganda as effective as possible, Himmler responds to this by saying, okay, I get it. I'm going to get right to work, and we are going to come up with better strategies. The first thing that Himmler does is he begins to systematize the party's propaganda efforts so that they can be applied in a rational and effective manner. He starts to think about the art of politics not as trying to talk to every voter everywhere in the week before the election, but more as a saturation bombing campaign. If we want to grow our vote share, we're not trying to win a majority in 1928. We want to just start to grow our vote share. Let's go to a particular area and let's have event after event after event. Let's hit them with the speaker on Monday, and then another one on Tuesday, another one on Wednesday, and maybe 4 or 5 on Thursday. Basically, you inundate the area with Nazi propaganda, and you pick places especially that maybe are not so full of rival propagandas, and people respond to it. If you want to use a kind of American political analogy, you say, well, okay, we've got a presidential election coming up. Let's say you're the Democratic Party. You don't say, oh, we're just going to spend all our money in the 7 battleground states or whatever it is. You say, we're going to go to Wyoming, and we're going to do tons of events in Wyoming. We're going to go to a particular congressional district in Kansas, and we're just going to saturate it. It doesn't matter if we got a lot of votes there before. We're going to saturate it. We're going to bombard it. We're going to make people in that little area go, wow, nobody ever shows up in my small town. I guess I'll listen to what they have to say. And even if you don't win a majority there, you're still going to convince some people to come over. And so this becomes the key foundation, along with violence, of Nazi electoral politics. Try to launch these kind of massive campaigns, hundreds of speakers, thousands of speakers in some cases. Let us overwhelm the opposition with constant propaganda, or constant engagement if you prefer that term. Another thing Himmler does is he draws up a list of Nazi speakers, and then he breaks them down into categories based on their prestige and their speaking ability. If we're going to hit this region, we want to make sure that we have the best speakers speaking in a kind of succession of each other so that we're not kind of diluting their effectiveness. If we're going to have a big music festival in Milwaukee called Summerfest, we don't want all the headliners going on Saturday. We want to space it out so that people are drawn back again and again and again. Himmler will also charge local parties with trying to be more professional in terms of their organizations, to come up with better ways of sort of systematizing the meetings, in terms of deciding where to hold the meetings. He will also borrow an idea from one of the other Nazis. The guy comes up with a correspondence course, says, okay, I'm going to, people are asking me about how to speak. Let me write some of this stuff down and I'll mail it to people. Himmler says, well, actually what we need is an NSDAP or a Nazi speaker college. Let us start to train people to be gifted in the art of persuasion, and that will amplify their effectiveness. Now, when the Nazis start this kind of saturation campaign, 1927-28, they don't really bear a lot of electoral fruit. There is a lot of working out of details that needs to take place before they figure out, oh, this is actually the best way to do it. Most regional elections in 1927, they only win about 2 or 3% of the vote. Himmler can come up with these grand plans for, okay, we're going to have, let's say, 400 speakers in a local election in the state of Mecklenburg. But because we actually don't have a lot of money at this point, we're actually only going to have 106 of those meetings take place. But again, they provide a foundation for what the Nazis will begin to call propaganda offensives. We are going to select an area. We are going to bombard that area with a variety of media, of meetings, of speakers, of marches. We're going to have dozens and dozens of political rallies in a single Gau or electoral district in just the course of 1 or 2 weeks. We're going to have parades on the street. We're going to have Nazi dignitaries go there so that the local Nazis come out and say, oh, wow, here's Himmler, here's Goebbels, here's Strasser. The Nazis encourage party activists, especially in small towns, to write personal letters to potential voters. Don't just do the mass mailings that we're familiar with today. If you've ever been to Iowa around, January of a presidential year, all these TV commercials, all these people knocking on doors. But if you get a handwritten letter from someone, well, that's a little bit more personal, a little bit more effective. The Nazis will select these places not just because they're having elections, but sometimes they say it's because they're not having an election. What are people doing in North Dakota today? They're probably not thinking a whole lot about politics because it's not electoral season. North Dakota is not known as a big electoral battleground state. This is a great time to go up and do some kind of campaigning up there because people will pay attention to it because there's nothing else competing with it. Just to give you a sense of how committed the Nazis became to these ideas of, again, the propaganda offensive, for the 1930 federal elections, which the Nazis go into as a party with just 2.6% of the vote, Goebbels plans on having 34,000 meetings in a single month. 34,000 in a single month. Now, as all these developments and techniques are being developed, Nazi planners like Heinrich Himmler also stumbled across a key insight that kind of shifts their thinking about the strategy that the Nazis are using. So I was talking about the kind of propaganda offensives. These are really tactical changes, right? This is how are we going to accomplish our mission? These are the ways in which we're going to do those things. But the Nazis also make a strategic change as well. Prior to 1927-28, most of the Nazi efforts go into trying to convince workers to join the Nazi Party. Right? Working class individuals are their primary targets, are the primary group that they think these are people that might have an interest in what we're selling, so therefore we're going to go after them. There's a variety of ways that we can see this, in addition to the tactical approach of where the Nazis putting their resources, they're pouring it into cities and the Ruhr Valley before 1927-28, but also in their kind of anti-capitalism. If you look at like the 1920 platform, for example, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there about interest and banks and kind of, anti-capitalism. And that's specifically meant to try to woo working class Germans. We talked in our last episode about Gregor Strasser and the kind of northern working group that he puts together to revise the party platform. He's talking about confiscating noble estates, things like that, nationalizing industry. Who is that going to appeal to? It's meant to appeal to workers. The problem with the Nazi Party, however, is that for most of the working class Germans that are exposed to them, they're not interested in what the party is selling. They remain social democrats or communists, as we've kind of talked about. They're not really that attracted to Nazism before the Great Depression. And so, how are we going to grow the Nazi Party? One of the things that they begin to realize in the summer of 1928 is that the party's electoral share in rural areas, especially places where there are farm communities in places like Bavaria, Thuringia, as I mentioned, Schleswig-Holstein, Lower Saxony. There are these pockets, these areas, even individual counties, where the party starts to grow from about 1 or 2% to 10 to 20%. So at the time that you're focusing on Berlin and the Ruhr and you're getting 1.3, 1.4% of the vote, and you're not really putting any effort into these kind of rural communities, and all of a sudden you went from, again, 1 or 2% of the vote to 18%, it starts to dawn on them that the people that you should be trying to sell Nazism to are not working class Germans in cities, but it is people living in small towns, in rural villages. It is farmers. It is people that own lots of land, so it could be nobles. And this proves to be a much more receptive group. Once you sit down and think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? What are some of the big problems that are happening, not even when the Depression is going on, but even before the Depression? One of the big problems is that agricultural prices are falling. These revolutions that we've seen in terms of technology and transportation, ships, refrigeration, railroads, these are going to increase the competition from foreign food suppliers, and it's going to make the overall sort of price of foodstuffs go down. That's wonderful if you're a worker or if you're a consumer, if you're a middle-class person living in a city. But if you're a farmer, that's a really big problem. The other thing that begins to happen is if you live on a farm, right? Farming is not traditionally very lucrative. So you have to borrow money sometimes in order to get the kind of capital improvements or to get the raw materials, the seeds that you need to plant. So farmers, especially in the 1920s, they're borrowing decent amounts of money. But in the 1920s, especially once you get towards the Great Depression, the credit market dries up. What is the SPD doing to address this issue? What is the Communist Party proposing to address this issue? The Nazis, on the other hand, had long argued for the creation of this kind of autarkic economic system. This is the idea that the country produces everything that it needs and wants. You don't need to really be importing stuff. The Nazis support the idea of reclaiming more land for peasants. The Nazis talk about reducing taxes, which is another issue of peasant grievance. And perhaps most importantly, if you think about Nazi ideals of race, race is based on the idea in some ways of isolation. Race, the idea of purity of race, coming from a sort of historical lineage or line of descent, the more isolated you are, the more racially pure you're supposedly going to be. Berlin, with 4 million people, with people moving in from all parts of the world and all the commerce and all the transportation, and Berlin is a city of cosmopolitanism. It's mixing. And when people are mixing, then racially they're mixing too. So the point I'm trying to make is that Nazi ideals of race already sort of praised farmers, praised the idea of working the soil, praised the idea of hard work not being something that you do through modern capitalism, investments, financial portfolios, stock market. But really, economic success comes from good old-fashioned hard work. And so, because the peasants are already closest to the land and are just more isolated from things, they're often associated with things like health and honor in Nazi propaganda before they realize that this is a group we really want to sell to. Of course, another part of Nazi ideology is anti-Semitism. In a big city like Berlin, where you're used to minorities, where you have a large synagogue, where there's a lot of people that are coming into contact with each other, anti-Semitism is a harder sell than it is in the rural areas where nobody's ever met a Jew before. Moreover, during the medieval period, Jews are stereotyped in some ways as being very cosmopolitan. It's one of the reasons that Jews get involved in being like peddlers and things like that is because there are Jews moving from Jewish community to Jewish community, and it's a little bit easier for them to move around than some rural Christians. This gives Jews in the eyes of rural people, not just in Germany, but across Europe, it makes them perceived as being rootless. They don't have a physical and geographic home. And so if the peasant is rooted and traditional and hardworking, it's easy for the Nazis to create a stereotype that they can sell to peasants that Jews are cosmopolitan, Jews are concerned about money, they're into capital, they're the ones that are keeping you from getting that loan you need for your farm. And so when the Nazis make this pivot, it is going to be saturating areas where there is the potential for exponential growth. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, I want to quote for a moment from an excellent book called The Nazi Voter by a historian named Thomas Childers. And in that book, he quotes a Nazi flyer extensively. He writes, quote, "Today, the farmer, in brackets, must mortgage the grain that will stand on the stalk in the summer in order to make the backbreaking tax and interest payments. His sons must migrate to the city as slaves of industry because the farm is mortgaged and arable land is shrinking." The Nazi flyer went on to define the situation as the result of, quote, "a senseless agricultural policy conducted by this regime," meaning the SPD and the Center Party, "and the parties in the interests of stock market capital," end quote. The flyer concluded, quote, "that the farmer sinks day by day deeper into debt and misery. In the end, he will be driven from his hearth and home, while international money and Jewish capital take possession of his land," end quote. Again, this is just one flyer, but you can start to see the appeal of National Socialism in rural areas among small farmers and villages. You can see the way that they're taking their grievances and blaming it on the SPD, on the Weimar State, in some ways on democracy, but especially also on Jews. Now, at the same time that Nazi authorities make this sort of shift towards what becomes known as the rural strategy, they also begin to make a strategic change in the cities themselves. They still do try to recruit workers, but they will try to kind of also make a branch out to go after the urban middle classes. And the people that they are most interested in trying to talk to are small businessmen, are the people that own kind of small shops. You're a tailor, you have a small clothing store. What happens when modern capitalism comes into your small town, or in this case, even into the big cities like Berlin? It's the Walmart phenomenon. Before you had Walmart and some of the other sort of big sort of superstores, a lot of these small rural towns, water tower towns as they're sometimes called, and a great song by Cody Johnson, water tower towns had like a local hardware store. They had a local supermarket. But what happens when the big chains come in? What happens when Walmart, with its economies of scale, can come in and say, look, we've signed this deal with Vlasic Pickles, in a classic example. they are going to sell us their pickles a heck of a lot cheaper than they're going to sell the local grocery store in a town of 1,000 people, well, then those local independent businesses go out of business. There is no Walmart in 1929 in Berlin, of course, but what there are is the big department stores. These department stores either start putting independent businesses out of business or they represent a threat to that. And of course, once the Depression hits, you start getting a lot of bankruptcies. And so the Nazis go to these sort of middle-class people and say, look, we are going to protect you from the communists who want to steal your private property. We're going to protect you from the big department stores because the big department stores are owned by Jews. And the reason that they're doing this is not just the business of business. It's that they really hate Germans and they're really trying to screw people over. They're trying to put you out of business. They're trying to destroy your livelihood. If you throw in a little criticism of government waste, questions of corruption and high taxes, again, this idea of big business, big labor is another one, right? So who's going to protect you from the Social Democrats? You have your little factory you're setting up. Who's going to protect you from the Social Democrats organizing and trying to kind of put you out of business, even though that's not really what they're trying to do? Germany, again, as one Nazi article held, was witnessing, quote, the battle of rich against the impoverished. Note there the way that it doesn't just say the rich against the poor. It's not just that you don't have any money. It's that you're impoverished. You've been taken to a place where you now have no resources and are barely trying to survive. You can't afford to wait to see if things get better. You're impoverished. The article further warned that, quote, this struggle will proletarianize more and more members of the middle class and bring the army of the unemployed ever greater numbers of reinforcements, end quote. So if you're a middle-class person, you have a business, a small business, what are you afraid of? It's not just the department stores, but it's also the communists. The more and more people end up in an unemployed situation, the more and more they're going to want to just tear everything down. So the message to the middle classes by the Nazi Party after 1928 is clear. Caught between the power of international and national financial forces and the socialist or communist mobs that are kind of reacting against them, the only shelter for the average man is going to be found in the Nazi Party. Finally, before we wrap up, there's just one other area that I want to cover in terms of the innovative nature of Nazi campaigning, Nazi electioneering. And this involves some stuff not just from 1930, but also stuff that they kind of pioneer in 1932. The story here will revolve around the use of modern technology. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was a lot of historical writing about the idea that the Nazis were anti-modern. You find this in the works of someone like Fritz Stern, for example, a little bit in George Mossy. There's a way of thinking about the Nazi Party, however, as not being anti-modern, but as alt-modern. There are ways that they embrace aspects of modernity and try to figure out how can they use that for their own benefit. And so this happens in terms of technology and the way that they embrace technology to use it for electoral purposes. The flashpoint for these changes begins in April of 1930 when Goebbels is promoted to not only being the Gauleiter of Berlin, but now he will be the Reich propaganda officer. He will be the main person in charge of electioneering for the entire German state. Now, in many ways, Goebbels, as we saw, had pioneered some of these techniques of violence. He understood the value of propaganda. He comes in and he takes Himmler's idea of the propaganda offensive and he says, this is a successful strategy. We're going to build upon it. As I mentioned, in the run-up to the 1930 electoral campaign, he plans 6,000 mass meetings and 34,000 smaller kind of local meetings. All of this is supposed to take place in just 6 weeks. Imagine the amount of logistical planning that went into planning approximately 40,000 meetings in 6 weeks. Goebbels, however, is also an innovator. He will improve Nazi speaking events by adding some elements that we've talked about before, things like torchlight parades by SA men, gives a kind of idea of order, have people show up in uniforms. We want to show, in addition to talk about, the idea that the Nazis are committed to order. Goebbels will also begin to coordinate the party's newspapers so that they all run the same articles and supply the same message. And for the 1930 election, happening during the Great Depression, they settle on a very basic one: bread and freedom. He continued and even expanded upon the SA's pattern of carrying out these sort of targeted attacks against communists and then also against social democrats. He continues to earn what we would call today free media for the party. And again, the Nazis will embrace technology and modernism in a way that their opponents do not. I mentioned earlier, what does Paul von Hindenburg do for his big re-election campaign in 1932? He's in his 80s at this point, so he's a little old, but he gives one speech and he records one sort of radio message. The Nazis, on the other hand, will record 50,000 gramophone records that can then be played across Germany so that people can listen to Hitler's speeches, even if he's not giving them or if he's not on the radio. Goebbels says, well, what is one of the new media things that everybody's into? Oh, it's film. Let's do a 10-minute film of Hitler speaking, and we'll use this as an electoral device, right? You can't see Hitler speak, oh well, but we'll make a video of him, and we'll play that film somewhere in a theater, and it'll be just like having an extra Hitler. For the runoff in April, Goebbels says, I got to go even further. What can I do? I've got it. I'm going to do a Führer over Germany campaign. I'm going to put Hitler in an airplane and fly him across Germany to all these different places so that he can be kind of everywhere at once. Now, flying an airplane in the early 1920s is not an easy thing to do. It is not, they don't have an amazing track record of safety like modern aviation companies have. Flying in an airplane is pretty dangerous. There are times when it's like, well, you know what? We probably shouldn't fly. But Hitler and the Nazis are like, nope, we got to do it. We got this campaign. Let's fly through the fog. Let's fly through the clouds. And as a propaganda event, this sort of stunt is massively effective. It's not just that Hitler gets to go to all these different places and see these different people, but it generates free media. Wow, look at this Hitler guy. He is flying on airplanes. This is modern technology. If we're thinking about who we want to lead the country into the future, do you want the guy that doesn't know how to use a DVD player? Or do you want the person that's mastered AI? Of course you want the more modern person. And so basically across the first half of 1932, more and more Germans come to see Hitler and the Nazis as the only effective antidote to the doldrums of the Depression and the rising threat of communism. What are the Democratic parties doing? What are especially the other liberal and nationalist parties doing in this period? Oh, they're going to have a meeting. They're going to have some guy get up there, and he's going to kind of drone on and maybe read off of a pre-printed, and maybe read off of a speech that he wrote on some paper. The Nazis look dynamic. The Nazis look different. And this is just as much a huge part of their political appeal as the ideological parts of it. Slowly but surely, the combined effect of these changes that I've been talking about over the course of the podcast today led to the Nazi electoral breakthrough first in 1930. Across the fateful year of 1928, so even a little bit before this, party membership has increased from 100,000 to 150,000. In June 1929, before the onset of the Great Depression, the Nazis took over their first city, the Franconian town of Coburg. In October, again, 3 weeks before the fateful stock market crash in New York, the party receives 7% of the vote in the more liberal state of Baden. Now, 7% is not going to be like, oh my God, they got 7% of the vote. But if it was like a presidential election in the United States and a party got 7% of the vote, they would get some free media time. People would start to go, who are these guys? In November, they get 8% in Lübeck, and then 11% in Thuringia in December. The real shocker comes on the 22nd of June, when the Nazis take almost 15% of the vote in Saxony. They actually outpoll the communists in a place that is traditionally a left-wing stronghold. Now, the main winners of that election is the SPD. They win it easily, overwhelmingly. Saxony is still very kind of left-wing in that period. But the tea leaves are kind of pointing to Nazi advancement, more Nazi electoral success. And on September 14th, 1930, when Germans go to the polls for the first time since the start of the Great Depression, and they're going to elect a new parliament, the largest party remains the Social Democrats. People are not yet willing to give up on Weimar. The SPD takes about 25% of the vote. The communists made some gains, as you might expect. They rise to 13% of the vote, and they gain 23 new Reichstag delegates. The Center Party and the Christian National Peasants and Farmers Party also do okay. But the clear winner here was the Nazi Party, whose new electoral tactics and strategies led to taking of over 6 million votes, or 18.25% of the total. Seemingly overnight, the Nazis had gone from being a small, electorally insignificant party with just 2.6% of the vote to becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. There's a lot more we could say in terms of unpacking where this growth came from. For example, about a quarter of the Nazi vote in 1930 actually comes from people who'd never voted before. If you think about the voting class, if you will, or the voting electorate in 1930, you're talking about the youngest generation, the youngest members, being people who came of age during the turmoil of the Weimar Republic, during the experimentation of the Weimar Republic, the freedoms of the Weimar Republic that not everybody wants to see. And so as they look at what's going on, they look and they say, we want a modern force, a strong force. We're concerned about the future. We want someone to take control. To use that phrase from the Brexit campaign, which is so powerful and so effective, right? People want agency. They want control of their lives. That's what the Nazis are selling to young people who are a little bit unsure about, what's going on, these changes in society. The Nazi Party also increases substantially with older voters, especially nationalists who look back on the imperial era and who say, wow, I remember we had a Kaiser, we had a pretty powerful authoritarian figure, and actually things were good. We had colonies, we had a big military, we were building battleships, we had scientific breakthroughs. Then we lost the war, and we have this weak Weimar Republic, and we're still paying the French, we're still paying the Belgians, we still have limits on our military, we don't have colonies anymore. I miss the good old days. But the Kaiser's in the Netherlands, and we're not really going to be able to put together a kind of monarchy again. What's the next best alternative? The Nazis seem like the thing that's most like the German Empire. They seem like the thing or the people who are most interested in returning Germany to a place of strength and a place of national glory. Finally, the Nazis also pull ideologically a little bit from the liberal parties, but especially from the nationalist and conservative groups that were kind of more traditional, more established. People by 1930 start to say, wow, we are in a pretty bad pickle here. I don't know if the politics of notables are up to the challenge of fighting back against the communists. So the Nazis, again, if you put all this together, by 1930, they have become, or they are perceived as being, dynamic and refreshing and innovative. And so regardless of how you feel about their ideology, for a lot of Germans, at least a significant amount of Germans, they seem like a better choice than the thing we were doing before that isn't working. After several years in the proverbial wilderness, in the fall of 1930, the Nazis arrived as major political players at a moment in which Weimar's democracy was literally falling apart. As such, they felt entitled to a seat at the negotiating table as the anti-democratic conservative elites began their quest to build an authoritarian alternative. The Nazis did not begin this game as the clear favorites to seize power. In fact, the idea probably struck many people in 1927 or 1928 as absurd. But once again, Hitler's intuitive understanding of power and the overall political fortune that the Nazi Party would enjoy would win out. We'll unpack the kind of details of this, the intrigues of it, a little bit more in our next episode when we'll tell the story of how Hitler became chancellor. This, to give you the short version of events, there is a lot of political horse trading that happens, a lot of intrigue, a lot of sort of behind-the-scenes political maneuvering that starts in 1930. It really gets going in 1932 and ends in January 30th, 1933 with Hitler's appointment as chancellor. But again, that's something we're going to talk about next time. That's going to be it for now. As always, if you've enjoyed the episode or found it useful, we'd love it if you would hit the like button. Alternatively, you can go on Apple Podcasts, you can go on Spotify and give us a rating. If you want to throw us a 5-star rating, that would be so appreciated. If you want to tell your friends and family about us, if you're in school, you want to tell your professor, tell your fellow classmates, this is more interesting than the boring old textbook you had to read. That's awesome. Please spread the word. We really appreciate that. So again, thanks for listening, and we hope you join us next time as we take history off the page.